All right, guys, thanks for coming today. I think we'll get started. The session today is a technical overview of Forefront Endpoint Protection 2012. Originally, when we were envisioning this session, we were going to talk about the current version 2010, but I thought this is Tech Ed. We want to hear about something new and exciting. So everything we're going to talk about today is going to be about a product that's yet to be released. So hopefully you find that exciting. My name's Harris Schneiderman. I'm a technology strategist. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been with Microsoft about 8 years, and 7 of those were in the US, and most recently based here in Australia. I'd also like to introduce my colleague, Jamie Sharp.
Thanks, Harris. Those of you who've been to a few Tech Eds know me. I've presented a lot of the Forefront products in the past. I've been at Microsoft for quite a number of years, and in fact, when we were preparing this session at dinner last night, it was interesting to note Harris mentioned that I started at Microsoft when he was still at university. So that's... That's
right. That's right. You started before antivirus software existed.
No, I'm not that old.
Okay, all right. All right, so what are we going to cover today? So I'm going to take you through the new product features, what's new in the product. I'm going to talk through the architectural changes. Some of those changes are in the product today. Some of those are not yet, but they will be when we ship, so I'll talk about that. And then we'll go through some various scenarios. How do we enable the product? How do we configure it? How do we monitor it? How do we manage it? So some of the key takeaways today. Hopefully you'll learn what's changed, what's new and exciting, how to set it up, how to be an administrator. We're going to take you through a variety of scenarios that a real live administrator would go through, and hopefully you'll see that the product's really simple and straightforward, assuming we do our jobs right today. So just before we get into it, just want to see a quick show of hands. Who has run or used Forefront Client Security 2007? Okay, so a couple hands. All right, good.
Apologies.
How about Forefront Endpoint 2010, current version? All right, a few more. Excellent. And has anyone in here never used Forefront or Config Manager before? Okay, we got a few as well. All right, so if we get stuck and you guys get lost, just let me know. I'm not going to try to assume too much, but it seems like most of the room is pretty familiar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the legacy products. Okay? So just a quick recap. For those of you not familiar with Forefront, we made a big change in the current version. And basically, FEP 2010 is built on top of Config Manager 07. Okay? So what that means is that we now have the scalability and the reach that Config Manager has. So previously in FCS 2007 was built on top of MOM 2005, which had some limitations in terms of size and scale. But now that we have Config Manager 2007, in the current version, we have a lot more scalability in the product, which is great. You'll see that will continue and even expand a bit in the next version that's coming. So that's a really nice feature. And of course, you know, we have the standard things that you'd expect in an AV product, right? We protect across a wide variety of malware. Jamie's going to talk in a few minutes about some of the advanced protection features in Forefront Endpoint. We protect against zero-day threats. We do deep integration with the Windows firewall. Jamie's going to show you how that works. And we are backed by Microsoft's Malware Protection Center. Anyone not familiar with that? We're going to tell you a little bit about it later. Okay. I'll turn it over to Jamie now, and he'll talk through some of the integration features.
Thanks, Harris. One important thing to note when we're talking about Forefront Endpoint Protection is the code that we're building is antivirus, anti-malware, rootkit, Trojan detection, prevention technology. And the reason why that is because we obviously have Windows 7 platform that we use for all the other features. So whilst some of the strategies of other vendors is to have a piece of code with firewall and maybe some DLP and a whole bunch of other capability built into that actual piece of code, Forefront Endpoint Protection is actually just an antivirus product because we leverage the benefits of the Windows 7 platform. So we have BitLocker and AppLocker and those firewall products and those type of capabilities. What we're working towards also is integrating some of those capabilities into the user interface. And when we go through FEP, you'll see how things like the firewall, how we can manage the firewall from Forefront Endpoint Protection and so forth. So whilst it is a separate product, we still can have some integration between the capabilities that we have in Windows 7 and our Forefront Endpoint Protection. What I wanted to really start with is explain how we do or how Microsoft does antivirus, and because probably one of the things that you're thinking about is this is a relatively new game for Microsoft, and a lot of industry a lot of companies have been in it for a very long time. What are our credentials in this space? From a perspective of now we're just looking at the malware engine, we actually have a capability called the Microsoft Malware Protection Center. You're probably most familiar with the Security Response Center. So that is the team that will send you the Patch Tuesday bulletins. So they work on the security bulletins and they have that process. In, I guess, parallel with that team, we have the Microsoft Malware Protection Center. Their charter is basically to be researchers, response, create the definitions and the engines, and come up with really the core anti-malware engine. Now, if you're familiar with Microsoft security products, you'd also know that we have multiple technologies. We have things like Microsoft Security Essentials, we have some Forefront server products, and obviously the Forefront EndPoint, and we have some anti-malware capability in our threat management products, our gateway products, and so forth. This team actually builds that one engine. So what we have done is we've consolidated all the capability for the anti-malware engine into the malware team. So whilst they're responsible for research and response, they also build the engine itself. So just a little bit about this team. It's a global team. We have a couple of main centres, obviously Redmond, Dublin and Melbourne, Australia. The interesting thing about the Melbourne, Australia team is that if you're old enough, you might remember a product called VET. That product was bought by, obviously, Computer Associates. And when we were looking a couple of years ago for malware people, as you can imagine, it's a fairly unique breed of person that does this role. We approached the head of that team, a gentleman by the name of Jacob Kaminsky, and suggested he might want to come along and have a new opportunity and work for us, which in fact he did. But his proviso was that if I go, I've got to take my whole team. So we effectively took the whole team out of Computer Associates, their whole Melbourne lab, and moved it into Microsoft. We now have doubled that team, so there's about 40 people in the Melbourne lab. The benefit of having a lab in Australia is, I guess, from a response perspective within our time zone, and also from the malware that we see within our time zone. There has been, and this isn't an SLA, but there has been times where we've seen particularly targeted pieces of malware at customers, and we've been able to respond to that really quickly, and I've been able to go down there and sit, because I actually sit a couple levels below me in the Melbourne office. We've been able to work through that and get a really rapid response for that.
I actually have an example from that. I had a customer who had that exact issue where they were a targeted attack.
That was what I was talking about.
That's right, and between the time that they submitted the malware to Microsoft, they called Premier 24/7 hotline. I think they had about a 7-hour turnaround time between when they submitted it and when they actually had updated signatures and updated code to protect them.
And that was actually a piece of malware that was crafted specifically to that customer and specifically spammed at that customer. That's the kind of threats that we're dealing with. If you're in that sort of, shall we say, resources industry, you are targeted for a lot of malware. Oh, sorry, the last point I wanted to mention about that is the Microsoft Security Response Alliance and the Antivirus Alliance. So it's an interesting comment that I'm going to make. We're not in the malware business or the anti-malware business to make money. We're in the anti-malware business to protect the security ecosystem. And proof of that is Microsoft Security Essentials, a piece of technology that we've provided free of charge or no charge to end users and consumers. And the reason why we've done that is this team produces a report called the Security Intelligence Report every 6 months. And what we do is we take all the analysis that we get and we put it into a report, and we provide that for you so you can actually see where the threats are coming from and interesting things that are going up and down. Believe it or not, now Java has overtaken Adobe as the most prevalent exploit factor at this present threat vector at this present point in time. So that team writes that report and delivers that report also. So the benefit of having the Microsoft Security Essentials free is that based on that report, we can see where the hotspots are, and we push it out into those countries. And obviously, you've got a lot of the Asian countries and so forth where there's a low bar and a lot of them don't have malware. So we just give that to them in the hope and belief that they will deploy that product and that will increase the security bar and get rid of zombies and so forth. Next piece is really the broad insight. So the next thing I come across when I talk to customers is to say, but how do you get your information? Well, we have an install base of over 600 million Windows machines. A lot of those are opted into a lot of information that we get, and we analyse that information. One of those channels is obviously Dr. Watson or Windows error reporting. It's actually interesting to note that we found configure via Windows error reporting. We actually identified that this was tested, I think it was in Korea. There was 200 instances of the server service crashing. They clicked the button that said report this to Microsoft. The people at Microsoft monitoring the Windows error reporting set off an alert to say, the server service, pretty critical to Windows. was crashing. They went and investigated it, and that's how they identified Configure. So it's not just the antivirus channels that we have, it's all the channels that we have within Microsoft that we can collate and get this information. So we have a whole bunch of sources there. The last piece is really the response, and we've touched on this already in that now you have one throat to choke. In the case of Harris's customer, they had a Premier agreement, they were able to ring for support, and we got that sorted out. That said, antivirus support, if you're being impacted, is actually a free of charge support call. So even if you don't have a support agreement with Microsoft, you can call them and we'll support you. The other thing that we can do is we have the malware portal where you can submit a sample and so forth. Obviously the experience between no charge and Premier is completely different. Premier will get you expedited and you'll go through your standard Premier process. There's no extra charge for antivirus support, so when you deploy Forefront Endpoint Protection, you don't have to take out an antivirus contract for your support. We just add that to your Premier contract. Let's look at the engine itself. We strive on being the best in class from an engine perspective. We've come a long way since the original engine. We're going to talk about the engine in a minute. We have a lot of, awards. AV Comparatives and VB100 are typically the two that most people look at for information on who is best and so forth. There's just a couple of seats down there. We aim to be in the top 3 or 4. And at times, because of when we find malware and Trojans and so forth, that can vary. Some of the more recent numbers that we're getting, retrospective and performance test. The core values behind the product is that it's going to be light, easy to use, low false positives, and we're getting that consistent response in the results that we're getting. Most recently, we got the August 2011 Virus Bulletin VB100. This is basically Virus Bulletin. They take 100 top samples and they throw it and they give a report on all the information. You can actually go to virusbulletin.com, you can sign up for that document and you can download that. It's a free document that you can download and see that. So that was just a quick, real, focus on, our engine is, one of the best in the market. With the release of our version 2 engine, so that was in Microsoft Security Essentials and the version of FEP, those that put your hand up for FCS, this engine isn't in Forefront Client Security. So it's a good way to migrate to FEP because you're going to get better level of protection than what you would running Forefront Client Security running FEP. So we have the standard generics heuristics. We have a way of being able to understand what is malicious activity based on not having to have a signature for it and being able to block that. It's fairly standard stuff. The next piece is really the dynamic translation. This is where our engine gets interesting. What we're able to do is, if something is detected via the heuristics or the generics, and we'll talk about it in a minute, behavior monitoring, we can then run that code in a virtual environment. So it's not like Hyper-V, virtual environment. It's just a little bit of sandbox that we run it in to say, okay, is this malicious or is it not malicious? And we make a decision based on that code. So this is this dynamic translation. So we can actually process the code before it runs on the box in a sandbox. The behavioural monitoring is interesting because at some point in time, it's not always a bad application or a bad piece of code. For instance, there might be a good piece of code, such as Notepad or Calculator or something like that, that might go bad and have a buffer overrun because somebody's worked out how to exploit it. So the behavioural monitoring is the piece that actually looks at what's happening and understanding, tracking when processes go bad. This new piece is a dynamic signature service. So in conjunction with behavioural monitoring, if we detect something and we don't have a signature for that, what dynamic signature service will do is, and this is configurable, and we'll show this in the demo, is it will actually call out to Microsoft and say, hey, I've got this sample. Can you tell me if that is, if you have an update for that? Consider this scenario. Your machines, your AV definitions are updated every 12 hours or every 24 hours. Let's say every 12 hours. At 11 hours and 59, you get a new piece of malware on that box that you're not detecting for. You're exposed. What dynamic signature service will do if it's enabled is it will actually detect that and it will say, okay, this is interesting. This is a piece of malware. It could potentially be. It'll go out using the dynamic signature service to Microsoft, say, okay, yep, I've got a block for that, and it'll send that block just down for that, and it'll block that piece of code, piece of malware via the dynamic signature service. The final piece is network vulnerability shielding. This is what we use for IPS. We do it a little bit differently. We have some capability called Network Inspection Service. It's in TMG, so if you play with TMG, you've probably already seen this. We look on the wire for malicious activity. Because we know what, if, in a security bulletin, we know what pieces of codes are being exploited via configure or whatever, we can write a signature for that. It's a bit like an AV signature, but all it's doing is basically looking on the network trace and seeing what's in there. If it matches one of our signatures, we'll block that. If we enabled NIST for every vulnerability, you'd get no performance out of your client because obviously it's continually, the more you inspect, the slower the performance. It's this catch-22. So when NIST starts, it actually looks for the update status of that box, and it says, okay, so I don't have this bulletin, then I'll instantiate this block for NIST. If the box is fully patched, NIST doesn't instantiate anything because the box is effectively fully patched. So what we do there is we're actually using IPS to block attacks for common Microsoft or for Microsoft security vulnerabilities. So if you've got our friend Configure in the network, machines sometimes pop up and they're not patched for Configure, and if you're running FEP will actually protect because it'll block that attack on the box. So what I'll do now is I'll flip over to the demo box and I'll just show you a video by one of our malware researchers.
Hey folks, it's Randy Trite with Microsoft's anti-malware team talking about one good reason to opt into Spynet. One good reason to opt into Spynet is the Dynamic Signature Service. The Dynamic Signature Service is new in FEP 2010 and provides real-time signature delivery from the cloud in response to reports of malware that we see on the system that we haven't shipped a signature for. And let's see how that works. So what I'm going to do is run this program, Total Secure, which is a Trojan dropper that is malicious but we don't have detection for. It drops ICAR on the system, and of course we have detection for ICAR, but we don't have detection for the Trojan dropper itself. So even though the user says to remove the malware and thinks they're back in a clean state, their system is actually still infected with that Trojan dropper, which could be doing who knows what on their computer. One new feature in FEP 2010 is behavior monitoring. What behavior monitoring does is detects behavior that of programs running on the system that is suspicious. If we look in the system event log, we can see the ICAR detection here and the removal here. But there's a new event, in this case, the behavior monitoring event. We see that the system has detected that this process, evil.exe, process 1256, has dropped no malware on the system, and that matches one of our behavior monitoring signatures. If this computer was opted into Spynet, we would send that report up to the cloud and ask, hey, do you know anything else about this suspicious file? With Dynamic Signature Service, the cloud can respond back and say, well, yes, in fact, that's malware that we've written a signature for. It just hasn't shipped out yet. So let's take a look at how this works with Dynamic Signature Service enabled after opting into Spynet. Let's opt into Spynet. We'll just choose the basic membership. And now this computer will actually send those suspicious behavior monitoring reports up to the cloud and get that opportunity to have a signature delivered in real time. I'm going to open this folder and ask you to keep an eye on it. This is where signatures from the cloud get delivered on the local machine. So this time when we run this same program again, we'll see the detection for ICAR. Watch this folder. We should see a signature coming down. There it is, in real time from the cloud. And if you look down here in the FEP UI, you'll see that it updates to show that there are 2 threats detected instead of just the ICAR detection. So we see ICAR's status is suspended. That means we blocked it from being written to disk. And now we see the Trojan dropper, which is actually detected as being an active infection running on the system. Now when we say apply actions, FEP 2010 can remove both the ICAR file that was blocked as well as the active malware on the system. The system is now clean and back in a good state. It's no longer on your network infecting other systems or sending data out or doing any number of nefarious things. And I hope that gives you a good reason to opt into that, at least that basic level of Spynet telemetry. Thanks for watching.
Good stuff. So everything we've showed you so far is available in the current product that's released today, FEP 2010. All right? So any of you that are running it today, this is a built-in capability. Any of you who aren't running it today, it's available for you if you're interested. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift gears and talk specifically around what's new in FEP 2012 and what's coming. So one of the big, I think, concerns around a lot of administrators who have run Config Manager before is they'll say, well, a lot of things that happen in Config Manager don't happen very fast, right? And that's deliberate. If you want to take inventory across your entire environment, you don't necessarily want 100,000 clients reporting in 3 minutes. That could overwhelm your system. So some things in Config Manager happen slowly, and that's by design. But there are other things in Config Manager that we want to happen really quickly, particularly related to malware. So if I detect a malware event on a client, I want to know about that very, very fast. And so what we've done is we've built this essentially high-speed data channel into Config Manager 2012 so that basically the worst case delay between when we detect a malware event and when we see that notification in the console should be 5 minutes or less. So that's something that we're tracking to in RTM, and that's an important piece because certain malware-related events are very urgent. There's a new set of built-in roles in FEP 2012, and those are related to what is very common in most large enterprises, which is that typically there's someone who does desktop management, and there's someone who does server management, and there's someone who does malware administration. And those folks generally today run separate systems, and they have their own sandboxes that they need to work in, and they don't want to get in each other's way. So what we've done, now that all of this is built on top of Config Manager 2012, what we've done is we've built these delegated security roles so that when people log into the console, they're only going to see the collections and the capabilities that are relevant for them so that they can do their work as an administrator without having to worry about messing up what someone else is doing. So we restrict their control so that from their viewpoint, they're running a separate system, even though it's on the same infrastructure via the same product, Config Manager 2012. We've changed the way that we deploy definition updates. So what you saw in the demo was just sort of a standalone client scenario where each client is individually downloading definitions. Well, that's fine in a small environment. That's OK for your home. But it's not great when you have a large enterprise environment. So what we do is now FEP 2012 uses the same deployment mechanisms that are built into Config Manager, namely that we distribute our updates via distribution point. So we try to download over the WAN one time, no more than that, and then we distribute those out to the other systems. So that way, we're trying to be more network friendly and also leverage the infrastructure that's already in place with Config Manager 2012, and if you're on 2007, those DPs will update. There's a great session at TechEd, if you haven't been to it, on upgrading from Config Manager 07 to 2012. If you haven't seen that, it's a very good one. I highly recommend it. Because we're built on top of Config Manager, we benefit from all of their scalability and performance improvements. So if you want to build a site that has 100,000 plus endpoints, no problem. Config Manager can handle it. FEP can handle it. It's much simpler to set up and operate. I won't spend a lot of time there because Jamie's going to show you a great demo on that. But one of the things I really like is you can do email subscriptions for alerts. So you may have some folks that work in your environment who don't log into the console every day or don't want to sit in front of a console and watch things. They just want to know when there are important things that happen and get an email notification. And you can set that up through FEP 2012. I'm going to take a few minutes and go through the architecture. What I've started with is the current architecture with Config Manager 07 and FEP 2010. This is what it would look like. Okay? And I'm just going to go through and show you what the changes are in the environment. Hopefully you'll like this. I think it actually is a really positive thing. So number one, we've done some great unification around the clients. So previously there was a Config Manager advanced client, and there was a FEP 2010 client. And you deployed Config Manager, and then you had to then go and deploy FEP 2010. What we do in this architecture, we haven't gone to a single MSI, but what we do when we install Config Manager 2012 is we actually pre-deploy the installer for FEP 2012. So that installer is already there, so when you're ready to enable it, it's almost like just turning it on, and we'll show you that. So it is still a separate MSI, and there's a good reason for that, because we use that same engine in a variety of other products. So Intune Endpoint Protection is the same engine. Microsoft Security Essentials is the same engine. So there's a reason to keep it modular, but it's already pre-deployed and ready to run when you're ready to turn it on. We used to deploy all of our configurations and updates via packages in Config Manager 2007, and we've changed all that. Now they're actually deployed via policies. So you don't have to load packages. That's a less efficient mechanism. You can do all of that via policies in the console, which is great. We used to have separate databases. You had to have an operational DB and a reporting DB. that was separate from Config Manager to run FEP 2010. You no longer need that. We've taken all the configurations and settings and put them into the Config Manager DB, and we published that new table structure. So if you want to figure out what's new in the database, we've done that. But now you can run it off a single database, which is the Config Manager database. So there's less SQL you need to run, which is great. All of the add-ons, the Excel templates and the reports and things like that are now actually part of Config Manager, so we've done an integration there. There's no longer a need to run this FEP service, so that's gone away. Instead, we have what's basically a new role within Config Manager 2012. We call it the Endpoint Protection Site role. So it's something that you essentially enable. In the previous version, you had to actually install Forefront Endpoint on a server. Now it's just turning on a role in the environment. And I'll talk a little bit about how we configure that. So get rid of all that stuff. This is what the new architecture looks like. It's a lot simpler and cleaner. There's less moving parts, and it's much easier to set up, which is great. One of the commitments that we've made with this release of FEP 2012 is that you shouldn't require any significant increase in infrastructure if you want to turn that on. So if you've got an existing environment that's well-sized, there shouldn't be any significant impact to the infrastructure to run it. So rather than having an infrastructure to manage your systems and an infrastructure for malware, now you can run them all off the same environment, which is great. So we're going to talk about really 3 areas of the administration experience today. One is how to enable it and set it up. I talked about that a little bit. I'll talk about that a bit more. Configuration, how do we configure policies and updates and definitions? How do we push out the client? How do we turn on the firewall settings? Jamie's going to show you all that. And then the monitoring. There's a new dashboard for events. How do I handle operational actions, reporting, things like that? We'll talk about that today. Oops. So we talked about this, right? Server setup is fully integrated with the Config Manager installation. It's just a role you enable. It's very, very simple. It's basically a checkbox. There's no separate installer for the role in Config Manager. So I did this session last week in New Zealand, okay? So a little bit of different audience, maybe not as quick, okay? So and I said, there's no installer, right, to run endpoint protection, and I got a comment that said, of course there's an installer for the client. So I want to make sure that's clear, okay? There is an installer for the client for the endpoint that runs on your system, but there isn't an installer for the role. It's just a checkbox to enable, just like you'd enable a site server or a DP and things like that, okay? So just to be clear, there's no separate database as we talked about. There's no separate console. Oh, got a question.
Does that mean you've moved the logging for Forefront Endpoint Protection as part of the CM logs area as well? And also, do you have a list of what those log names will be?
We do, actually. I'm going to talk about that. So there's 2 sets of logging. There's server-side logging, and there's client-side logging. There actually will be a specific log file just for that. So for those of you who troubleshoot Config Manager for a living, you know that the secrets are all in log files. There's a specific log for Forefront Endpoint, and I'll tell you exactly what that is. It'll be coming up. So that'll be a useful one.
Is the Forefront license coming with a license to run Config Manager?
That's a good question. So the question was around licensing. Let me table that for a minute. I'm going to talk about that very shortly. Okay? All right, I'm going to keep going. See, you just preempted me. All right, so as I talked about, there's a new role. So when you install the endpoint protection role, you're going to get the standard, Microsoft dialog is going to come up and say, please accept the license agreement. There's a little box you check, you click agree, and it goes through, okay? There's no license verification in that installer. So we trust you that if you check that box and say, I agree to the license agreement, you're agreeing that you are properly licensed for Forefront Endpoint. We're not going to verify anything. Now, there has been a change in the licensing, and I'll talk about that briefly. It's not a licensing session, but just I'll give you the short version. Forefront Endpoint used to be most commonly purchased via the Enterprise Cal Suite or the Forefront Protection Suite. So if you owned either of those, or you could purchase it standalone, you were licensed for Forefront Endpoint Protection 2010. We've recently made a change in our licensing where now customers who own the Core Cal Suite are now licensed for Forefront Endpoint Protection. So for those customers, and most customers with enterprise agreements and other volume license agreements are licensed for Core Cal, they now, if their software assurance subscription is current, have the right to run FEP 2012. So that's a very good thing. Across their desktop environment, since the core CAL covers desktops and notebooks and things like that.
Just to add to that, it is a subscription license, so you can run FEP 2010 or FEP 2012 when it comes out. You don't need to upgrade your licenses when FEP 2012 comes out.
That's right, as long as you're current on SA,
Yep.
correct. Now, if you are considering licensing FEP for your server environment, again, you can do a standalone per-device subscription for your endpoints. You could license it via the Enrollment for Core Infrastructure, ECI. So for those of you who are ECI customers today, you're licensed to run FEP 2010 and 2012 when it comes out.
My question is about,
Sorry?
my
Let's go back to
is
your
about-
question.
We've got the endpoint licenses already,
Mm-hmm.
but when we do the upgrade from the old Forefront client, are we getting a config manager server license to
No, that's a
require?
That's a good question. So you do need to have a license for Config Manager Server. There are two variants for that. There's with and without SQL. You need to have one of those in order to run Forefront Endpoint. The server license is not included with the license for Endpoint.
And unlike in FCS, the configuration manager client is also needed to be purchased for the clients. So
Yep.
you need the config
You need
manager
the
client and
CML
the endpoint client.
for an endpoint or an SML for a server.
We actually do desktop deployment via the imaging method, so we have no configuration manager at all. Can this be done without configuration manager at all?
Yeah, so from both a management standpoint in terms of running the client, you know, if you want to have a heads-up console to run, you'll need a server for that. You can run it standalone if you want, but you don't have any, obviously, monitoring or overall management. And the requirement is for this current version of the product that you have to have a config manager license. So that's the assumption. So in your scenario, we need to look at a way to resolve that.
So it sounds like the operational management side has been moved into the configuration manager product, whereas it used to be in...
That's right. It used to be built on top of MOM 05. That's right. Correct. That's right.
Yeah, we changed the strategy to configuration manager because the MOM just wasn't scaling, and MOM wasn't designed to do software deployment. You know, if you look at config manager and FEP, you've got monitoring, reporting, deployment, management, and anti-malware. And we had to build that into Ops Manager where it was already in Config Manager. So that's why we made the decision a couple of years ago to move across to Config Manager.
Okay, I'll take one more.
Probably not related to this, but you know with Config Manager how you've got Windows Update Services included into it and it's still a standalone add-in in Config Manager.
Mm-hmm.
Is that Microsoft's roadmap to move that similar to FEP that is actually part of Config Manager?
That's a good question. So the question is, WSUS or Windows Update, you know, is a separate role that you bring in. Where's our strategy? Where are we headed with that? So I'll talk about that a little bit in this slide, but essentially we wanted to offer two options, okay? Option number one is, I don't have Config Manager, but I want to be able to do updates, right, and have a local update server. We believe that since the updates provided by WSUS are entirely our updates, which are essentially changes in our code that are things that we made a mistake, essentially, that we should provide that for free, okay? So WSUS is going to continue to be free as a role in Windows Server, right? But you also have the option, if you're going to run Config Manager and you want to integrate that in your environment, you can make a WSUS server into a software update point, which becomes another role in the hierarchy. So think of it, you've got Config Manager, you've got software update point is a role, endpoint protection is a role. So they can all fall under that umbrella of Config Manager. But we do give you that option to do it separate if you need to. For that scenario, for smaller customers that aren't running Configuration Manager. So just to give a little context to that, all right, so what you'll do, this is the Config Manager site server, so you all have that. There's the database, okay? You'll add a new role. This is the endpoint protection role. It could be on the same server if you want to. I'm just showing it sort of logically broken out. When you set up that role, we actually install the FEP client on top of it, okay? That's one for malware protection, of course, but it's also because you need the FEP client to provide synchronization with the update server, okay? So that could be Windows Update / Microsoft Update, and by default, we'll show you this in the console, we're going to synchronize with that server every 8 hours. Where did 8 hours come from? Well, it's 24 hours in a day. We can push on average 3 updates per day if we need to, so 24 divided by 3 is 8. So that's where the default is. In some cases, in a zero-day exploit scenario, we could push more, so if you want to tune that, you're welcome to. So we synchronize with the server every 8 hours. And then we can synchronize between this server and the site server every 15 minutes by default. If they're on the same box, obviously that's not as relevant, but just something to keep in mind. You only need one, at most, endpoint protection server for that role. So worst case scenario, if you want to split that role out, you need one extra box. All right, so let's go through a little scenario. We've got a guy named Kevin, okay? Kevin is an anti-malware administrator, okay? And his world used to be running a kind of a standalone AV product. So what we do is we set him up and we give him a delegated role, which will show you that he's the FEP admin. And then when he logs into Configuration Manager, the only stuff he's going to see in the console are things that he has control over. So if he's got collections which he manages, he'll see those. But he won't see all the other Config Manager collections, and he won't see the myriad of options in Config Manager 2012 that have nothing to do with malware. So that's really good. So Kevin gets a nice simplified experience, a little sandbox to play in. He can create, modify, delete the anti-malware settings, which is great. He can assign them to collections that he has control over. Okay? He can create and modify alerts, and he can create and modify subscriptions to those alerts. So that's all he can do. All right? He can initiate operational actions, so he could trigger a scan or a definition update if he wants to. And then we have another person in this environment, and her name is Meg. Meg is a full admin for Configuration Manager, so she has a lot more rights. She has to set up Configuration Manager. She defines the site roles. She enables the server for endpoint protection to set that up, and gives rights to folks like Kevin so that they can control what they need to in the console. So you've got to set up Config Manager first and delegate that access, and then your anti-malware administrator can do their work. Okay? Similar would be for any other delegated role in Config Manager. Sometimes we have folks who just manage certain desktops or just manage at a particular site, and this process for setting that up is pretty much the same. So it's very familiar to someone who's run Config Manager before. Okay. Malware alerts are configurable per collection. So you may want to set up collections that have different behaviors. So maybe you want to run desktops differently than you run notebooks. And maybe you want to run servers differently. And maybe you want to do something different on executive laptops because they're sensitive and they need more love. Okay? So you can do that. You can set that up. There's different types of malware alerts available. And as I said, you can set up email subscriptions if you want to be alerted via email. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it back over to Jamie. He's going to do a demo of the console and show you how to deploy FEP to an endpoint.
Thanks, Harris. Actually, I'll leave that back up. Just want to show the links. So what we're running on the demo environment is FEP 2012 beta. You can actually download the code there and play with it, and also the technical library. So there is some documentation up online for the beta. The caveat is that what we're talking about today is the end point of where we're going, and we'll probably see feature complete in RC, which we're expecting at the Build conference, which is going to be next month. So what we're actually showing you today
actually
is...
this month now, it's September.
Yeah, it is September today, that's right, 1st of September. So what we're actually showing you today is the code in the beta code, which is a little different to what Harris was talking about, and I'll mention that as we go through.
But the good news is what we're showing you today, if you love what you see, you can download it today and play with it. Everything we're going to show you.
Absolutely. So that's basically the Config Manager 2012 console. If you've been to the Config Manager sessions already, you would already have seen that. And again, this isn't a Config Manager session. We're going to focus on the forefront pieces in the Config Manager console. The first thing that Harris mentioned was this situation where most organizations have a separate antivirus team and a separate management team. The issue that we had in FEP 2010 with Config Manager was that the delegation capability wasn't as granular as we would have liked. So therefore, if you wanted to replicate in your organization AV admin and management guys, the AV guys would still see a lot of stuff that they wouldn't really be suitable for them to view. So we've changed that. It's almost there in this build, and if we go down here and we have a look at the security roles, you'll see that we have got a couple of built-in roles now. So what you effectively do is you assign, so we've got the full administrator, so that's everything to do with FEP. What we've also done is, so this is a role, but it's also specific to the FEP pieces. So when you run as this person, all the bits that aren't relevant, the collections and some of the packaging and the software distribution and the asset intelligence and all that goes away, and they'll just see the forefront endpoint bits that are relevant to them. Then there's the policy author. So the policy author has the ability to author policies, but that's pretty much all they can do. So you might have the situation where you still want some control over your software distribution and your management, which you still want the management guys to do, but you want the security guys or the AV guys to set their policies and so forth. The final one there is the FEP policy deployment manager. So this guy gives you the ability to actually go out and deploy manage the collections and pick where the policies are going to be deployed to and so forth. So you have the ability to have those roles now and they're granular.
I actually had a customer, they were a big oil and gas company, and they had a really strict policy around separation of duties. So someone who authors a policy could not be allowed to push it out because it had to go through a form of approval. And so they'd have one person that did the authoring and one person that did the deployment. So you can see that capability is built into the console if you want to get that granular.
The next tab we go to is in the software updates. We still have, the same as FEP 2010 in this build, the 3 packages that we have. In the RC, that will actually go away because as Harris mentioned, it comes as a installer. The code goes out with the configuration management agent and you have the ability just really to turn it on. So you're not actually pushing the package out because the package is already there. The other piece that we have, which is relevant to one of the questions, is the software updates. In this particular case, we have the definition updates. What we've done in this version also is we've integrated the ability to use Config Manager natively for the definition file updates. So you still have the ability to go and use WSUS or Microsoft Update, or as we added in SP1 for FEP 2010, being able to use a share, if you wish to use a share in branch office. But now we have the ability to actually manage this and move it via Configuration Manager. As you can see, the icons there, what that means is the precedence. The icon with the green arrow, or the patch with the definition updates with the green arrow, they're the latest definitions. So as this is getting updated, you're not going to have, all the, which one do I choose? It automatically picks the latest one and uses that. And we'll see later in another demo the automated deployment of that. We have the dashboard, much like we do in FEP 2010. Obviously, this environment only got 2 computers, so there's not that much information in the dashboard. But the bottom line is it's all hyperlinked. You can click on that one computer and you can go into that computer and it'll take you into its information and you can go in and view all the information about the computer. If that computer had an issue, you could go in there and work out why. And the thing to note is when I'm a FEP administrator in that role, I only will see the FEP pieces rather than all the config manager pieces that you can do to that particular device.
And you'll notice here when he clicked on that hyperlink in the console, it took him directly to the collection in question. So it kind of jumped him up. So it made it relevant for what he was trying to figure out, which is which collection has FEP deployed. Yeah. So we've gone from we were in monitoring and now we're in assets and compliance, which is a good piece because now we can actually go and look here. We still have a whole bunch of native collections that we put in that you can put devices in, and we'll, based on the analysis of that device, we will put the device into those collections. So you might have a collection that is out of patch or out of definition file or infected or something like that, and that collection you can actually do an action on. We'll see that later on and what you can do on that collection. And finally, we have fairly similar to FEP 2010. We have a bunch of policies that we have out of the box. Obviously, the default server policy and the default desktop policy. We'll see a little bit more about that when I do another demo, but we'll use those policies to do some interesting things. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to push out, and for the FCS people in the audience, here we have a box running Forefront Client Security. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you how we can upgrade that to Forefront Endpoint Protection. The installer, as you may be familiar with FEP 2010, still has the capability to find and remove Forefront Client Security, Symantec, Trend, and McAfee, the current version and the previous version. So there's no interaction. The only caveat is that if you have anti-tampering, you need to turn that off because obviously the FEP package can't uninstall something if you've got anti-tampering. But if you disable that, we'll be able to find it and remove it. It's part of the package. So there's my Forefront Client Security. Let's just go back here. And what I want to do is I want to actually send a package out, and I'm going to pick on my Chicago machine. Oops.
on that. We're going to deploy a program. So we saw where before we had the 3 packages. What we're actually going to pick is the install piece of FEP. So that's the deployment package that we saw before. We're going to say, oops, high
Make it
priority.
required.
Oh, sorry. I'm obviously expediting this for the purposes of the demo, so that's why we're just going to push it out quickly. As soon as possible. Now we've got some options to do restarts and overrides. Again, this is configuration manager piece. This isn't FEP. The only FEP piece here is I've picked the FEP package effectively. Yep, that talks about distribution points. And pretty much we're done. So what we've done now is we've created a deployment and we've pushed that out to this Chicago machine. It's sitting there waiting. Typically, depending upon your settings in your config manager, it'll wait a little while. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here and I'm going to find my config manager properties and I'm going to basically say, go and update your policy. Now what we should see, we're actually going to come back to this because it'll take a little while to upgrade, but what you should see in Task Manager, so a config manager there. Did I save that?
Yep, it'll take a minute. It'll come up. You'll see it'll kick off the install process in a moment.
So we're basically waiting for the config manager agent to go and get an update, which we forced.
Why don't we come back to it in a minute? We'll keep going.
Yep.
It'll work. So keep an eye on this icon here. This is FCS. This one's going to go away.
That script hasn't started. Oh, we'll come back to that. You're going to do the software distribution one? Oh, I'll do it later. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
You want to click me over?
Yep.
The two?
Oh, there we go. When I pressed the button, it went.
All right.
You just saw the script. It's presentation time. It's way shorter than normal time.
All right. So second thing I'm going to talk about is an automated deployment rule, or an ADR. Okay. This is what we talked about earlier, where basically I can enable a policy to deploy new updates and new signatures and things like that. It's going to follow the policy that I set out. So if I want to leverage, as Jamie said, UNC share, or a local distribution point, or go straight to the internet, which I might need if my client's disconnected from my network, I have the ability to set that up. Jamie will show you that a little later. It's good for deploying both the initial updates and any subsequent updates. So one of the big differences between FEP 2012 and previous versions is, in previous versions, we actually gave you a signature when we initially deployed the client. And that was great when we first released the product. But then when you installed it, years later, you had a signature that was like 2-3 years old, which really made absolutely no sense. So best practice is when you push Forefront EndPoint 2012, make sure you enable an automated deployment rule to push the new signatures. So we'll show you that in steps, but when you do it in real life, make sure you do them together. So that's a good thing. Now, one of the really nice features is the way we apply randomization to the way the clients get signatures. So let's say I push a policy and say, I want signatures to get updated every Sunday at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I push that to 300,000 computers. Instead of all 300,000 checking in at the same time and trying to get a policy, which would be silly, we actually apply a randomization interval to it where we can spread the load plus or minus 30 minutes from that time. So that way, all those systems will stagger themselves naturally and check in within a reasonable window, but not all at once. And that's great in a typical scenario, and it's really great in a VDI scenario. If you have hundreds of VMs on the same workload, they're not all going to check in at the same time, which is really good. So Jamie will show you how to configure that. Okay, so as I said, malware settings and updates are deployed via policies in the RTM. We'll have that in there. Settings are per collection. So when we update collection settings, the default in config manager is every 60 minutes. So just for new settings, it would be that. But obviously, malware alerts are going to happen every 5 minutes or less. So that way, that's showing you kind of the different intervals that are available for urgent things versus non-urgent things. We have some out-of-the-box templates for server exclusions. Okay, so for those of you who are administrators, okay, what's the first thing you have to do when you install an endpoint? on a server. You got to go and you got to look up and figure out, okay, this is a domain controller, so I got to exclude these files. And all right, this is a DNS server, so I got to exclude these files. And you got to go and manually type all those in. Okay, that is a pain. I hate that. Most people do too. So we've actually built that in via templates, and Jamie will show you that you can say, I've got this server. The server's role is this, this, and this, and it'll set up all the exclusions for you automatically. So you can make sure that you get the configuration right, and you don't have to go through the tedious pain of keying those all in, which is really, really nice. When you have multiple anti-malware policies apply to a given system, we have a set of priorities. So that way there's kind of an ordered list, highest, middle, lowest, et cetera, so that you can decide which policy will actually apply. So highest priority always wins. So that way if you have multiple policies, you can decide which one should take precedence. Very much like what you might do with GPOs and things like that, or remote access policies. Very similar idea. Everything that happens from an anti-malware setting gets reported via a state message, which then gets propagated into reports. So just like we have state messages for updates where they're event-driven, so anytime the state changes, we send an update, it's the same thing for anti-malware settings. So we don't wait for a particular interval when there's something that needs to happen, we report it in immediately. Okay? We asked about logging. There's this new log file called the endpoint protection agent.log. This is where all the good stuff is. If you have an endpoint protection issue or you want to figure out what's going on, it's going to be in that log. Okay, that's a new one in the product. Now, Jamie mentioned our integration with the firewall. So again, the firewall is not in the client. Okay, it's not in Config Manager. It's actually built into Windows. But we can manage it all from Config Manager 2012 using a FEP policy. So Jamie's going to set up a custom policy, and he's going to show you how you can configure the firewall for your collection. So number one, we support multiple profiles. I'm sure you've seen that built into Windows. There's a domain profile, private and public. That's really good if you have systems that tend to roam around onto different networks. You can have different firewall policies for that. You can turn it on and off. You can block connections. You can set up notification settings for the user so they can see what the behavior should be if they have an issue. And again, you can do this on a per collection basis. So your CEO can get one policy, and your servers can get one policy, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all applied through configuration management settings. So we'll show you how to do that.
How does that interact with group policy settings or preferences?
It's a good question. And I think sort of the underlying question there, isn't that kind of redundant because I can do that via GPO? Yeah, it's a good question. So here's the way to think about it. This is my viewpoint. Config Manager doesn't make the assumption that you're in a domain. And there are many systems that you may manage with Config Manager that aren't necessarily domain joined, right? So this is giving you a mechanism. So if you don't have GPO available as a mechanism for your environment, you can set it in here. What I would recommend, if you've got machines and they're all members of a domain, is that you pick one. Okay, you say, I'm going to deploy firewall policy via GPO, or I'm going to deploy it via Config Manager. I'd choose one and stick with it because I think you'll get better consistency as opposed to applying two policies to a system. Because if you have two policies and they're updating at different intervals, you're going to see unpredictable and unpleasant behavior. So if you're using GPOs today and you love that system and you're happy with it, great. My attitude on this is, especially with notebooks that leave your network, right? If those notebooks don't have direct access or something like that, then they're not going to get a GPO refresh. So I can't get confirmation that they're doing it. Whereas if I use internet-based client management and configuration manager, I can be sure that when that laptop leaves my environment and it's on the network, it's still going to get updated and that policy is going to get applied. And I'm going to get alerts to Config Manager to let me know if something's gone wrong. So that's the advantage of this approach.
Are they complementary then? So I assume you've put a fair amount of time into your application teams to actually control, and you have a group policy base already there. But you've got, as you said, you've come up with the concept of an anti-malware team, and they turn around, we've got an exploit out there and they need to make an urgent change.
Mm-hmm.
Can that be sent? Will they coexist together, or is one going to stamp all over the other?
Well, if you've got a GPO and a Config Manager firewall policy that apply and they contradict one another, then that can create problems, right? You can have one refresh and then the other refresh, you'll see this kind of bouncing behavior, right? Whereas that's what I'm saying. If you pick one mechanism and say, this is going to be my mechanism for firewall policy, that'll be your base policy. And then when you have things like you were talking about earlier with zero-day exploits and things and the network inspection and things like that, then that's where it becomes more real time.
Yeah, so I guess that's where the concern is. I mean, our security team and our application management group are two completely separate entities and have different views on this.
Yep.
You would give control of this to your security management group.
That's right. So the point is that we've got an application management team and we've got a security management team, and they have different responsibilities and different obligations. Yep. So I definitely agree with you. I think in most organizations I work with, firewall policy is controlled by the security team. That's not to say that's the correct approach, but it's definitely one that I see as being more common.
But if you split it out via the roles, then in this version you can give the security team the control of the AV and the firewall still, and then they can choose whether they're going to do it via group policy or via configuration manager.
Yep. Okay, so the client is enabled in the client agent settings. You can decide if you want to do third-party removal. Again, we talked about that. It's a really good practice if you've got a third-party AV client or an old AV client in place to make sure that gets removed before you lay down forefront endpoint. AV clients don't play well together. They tend to cause problems. So that's a good practice. So if you deploy Config Manager and you're not quite ready to remove your other AV client, that's fine. Just don't deploy both at the same time. Okay? The admin can force or require reboots. We showed you that. You'll see in ours when we deployed it, a reboot was not required in our case, but it could be in some. You can notify the user if they need a reboot. You can forcibly reboot them if they need to. If the system's asleep and you need to wake it up, we have a mechanism for that as well, which you saw there. Everything here is policy-driven, as I said, and the installer is pre-staged on the system. So when I say run and apply, I don't have to actually wait for a client to be pushed over the wire. It's already there waiting to be activated. And again, anything that goes wrong from an install standpoint is there in that log. Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to Jamie. He's going to show you how to distribute signatures.
Thanks, Harris. And as you can see now, here's our client, and we have our forefront endpoint icon, which in this particular case is actually red. Because when we deploy it, as Harris mentioned, we don't actually push any updates to it. There's a couple of options, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But what I'm going to do in the next demo is I'm actually going to push some definition files to it. We have this new capability called, we talked about, the automatic deployment rule, which we have a default rule here. So I'm just going to go in here and actually change this rule. I'm going to target it at the correct machine. In this particular case, I mean, we're targeting this at a specific machine at the moment, but you'd be targeting it in a collection in a corporate environment. So I'm picking my demo machine. The rule is effectively already set up. Now I'll just go and enable that rule. And then we'll run it. Run it now, just so we can force it. And again, I'll go back to my software, and I'll just give my policy a kick, and that'll actually go back and it'll download and do the updates, and we'll see that change. So I'll hand back to...
Yeah. So when we come back, that angry red icon should be nice and green and happy if everything works well.
Question. So you've got a distributed config manager hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
That software update scan, a metadata scan, goes against your primary site, for example. So is that coming from a central data set, or is that coming from...
No, so the scanning mechanism should come via, so the policies come from the local MP, okay? Distributions come from the local DP, okay? The scanning comes from the software update point, okay? So if your hierarchy's set up so you have local machines to do that, then it's going to come locally.
So my question is that those definitions have to be distributed to all your DPs. So you might have a SUP locally, and you might scan your metadata there, but your download of that definition may come from a central location, right?
Yeah. And in Config Manager 2012, we go away from a hierarchy. It goes to a flat. So basically everything is a distribution point in 2012.
So if I've got a site with hundreds of sites,
yep,
my definitions will download from a central location effectively, is what you're saying. Not,
well, they'll go to the distribution points.
which is central.
Okay. Yep.
Yep. So it's all about how you set it up. And again, you can set up an ordered list. So you can say, my first attempt is going to be to try to get from a DP. I'm going to try to locate a DP if I can, and if I can't find one, then I'll go out to the internet because I'm obviously not connected to the network or there's some sort of problem. So you can give a variety of choices so that the client will be able to figure out a way to get an update no matter what.
Internet check is a policy configured in config manager.
That's right. That's a policy. We're going to show you that in a little bit. So again, remember it's DP or UNC path or internet.
Yep. And before we go on, you can see that that's now green.
It's working.
And we've got our updates. So basically what we've done there in a couple of mouse clicks is we've upgraded a Forefront Client Security client, we've sent out some updates, and we're up and running with Forefront EndPoint. And the only thing we really needed to know about was some configuration manager wizards.
Yeah. Now normally if you did this for real, right, when you deployed your client, you'd have that ADR rule automatically enabled so that when it came down, it'd get updated immediately. But I wanted to show you the different steps. All right. So got a new dashboard. Jamie showed that a little bit. The focus in the dashboard is not to show you everything. It's to show you actionable events. It's to show you things that as an administrator, you need to do something, okay? So a lot of stuff happens automated, and we'll let you know, yep, it happened, the client's protected, we did our scan, so on and so forth. But all the major alerts are things where you need to get involved, you need to be aware, so that we can draw your attention to that. The dashboard is scoped to the collections that you have rights to. So you're not going to see data from every machine in Config Manager. You're only going to see it for the collections that you have rights to as the administrator. Remember, the alerts will come in 5 minutes or less, so that the console should be very current. You don't have to hit refresh, refresh, refresh all the time. It should update automatically. Everything, as I said, is event-based. So if something changes, if the state changes, if the definition version changes, things like that, that's going to trigger a scheduled, a non-scheduled, an event-based update to the console. All right. So some of the operational things you have to do, right? That, normally these things would happen during policy, updating definitions, scans, and things like that. But you may have an alert happen. A user may call and say, something's wrong, I'm seeing something, I want to initiate something right now, I want it to happen. There's these operational actions that you can do, and those are all built into the console. I call those the big red panic button. You can say, I need to do this right now, and it'll happen. We'll show you that. So things like full scan, quick scan, get new definition updates, et cetera, are all built in. And you can even set for your scanning policy. So if you say, hey, I want to scan once a day, you can say, I want to get definition updates before I scan to make sure that I'm scanning with the latest and greatest, which makes sense. We have reports built in, just like we had in 2010. We've preserved report parity, so if you have reports that you really love in 2010 and you want to make sure you have them in 2012, you can all relax. They're in there. Everything's good. But we have some additional reports, which are very nice. They're user-centric reports, and that really aligns with one of the themes in Config Manager 2012, that you can target things from a user-centric perspective as opposed to a device perspective. So, for example, how would that play out in an anti-malware context? Let's say you're curious to know who are my users that have the most anti-malware alerts in my organization, right? You can actually run that report and you can see, here's my top offenders, right? Which is quite interesting, because what it'll do is it'll pull data together from every device that Config Manager knows is their device, where they're listed as a primary user. So if they have a notebook and a desktop and so on and so forth, you can have all that data pulled together in a user-centric format as opposed to a device-centric format, which is pretty cool. And we do that because of Config Manager. Again, the reports are scoped to the admin. And I'll turn it back to Jamie. He's going to show you how we could set up a policy and some of the tweaks you can do there, and then how to distribute it.
Thanks, Harris. So as you can see, we're picking on Chicago again, and you'll see that little yellow bar at the top. That basically states that this machine is under management by an administrator. If we look at some of the other settings, there should be some here. Oops, no, that one's, oh, there we go. So what we've done in this policy is we've actually said real-time protection, the user can change that, but everything else, the user can't. That's completely customizable. You might want to allow users to add exclusions, whatever. But for this particular example, we'll note that this scan is at 2 a.m. and the CPU usage by default in this policy is 30%.
Yeah, maximum 30%.
Yep. So if we go back into our config manager, we've got our default policies. So what actually happened was that machine's actually a server, and it got hit with this default server policy. And as we can see, there's a precedence on these. So what I'm going to go and do now is I'm going to create a new policy. And we'll call this Demo Chicago. Oops. Spell. So we have a whole bunch of options here. If it's a desktop, we can choose the desktop policies. But as Harris mentioned, we've got a whole bunch of policies built in. So we can go to next. Now this is a really piece I think of I'm excited about, because if you've seen the document, the KB article, and I can't remember the number off the top of my head, that says this is the document of all the products and these are the exclusions that you should do for a domain controller and all different types of things. All I've effectively done is accumulated all that and put that knowledge into these templates here. So this was in FEP 2010 where you could do this, but the problem with FEP 2010 was that if you chose multiple policies, it's not like a GPO that it would consolidate and give you a resultant set. You could only choose one. So if you wanted to do it if you had a DC that was a DHCP and a few other roles, then you had to make one yourself. But in FEP 2010, they've actually created it where you can basically choose, pick a DHCP, pick a DNS, pick a domain controller. I mean, that's a pretty typical machine, and you can add those roles. So what we'll actually do now is we're going to take all the information that we have about the exclusions and how to set that template up for that machine, and we're going to consolidate that into one policy.
Yeah, and you can see there was other roles there. There was Hyper-V servers, there was Exchange, SharePoint, et
Like
cetera.
17
all the
different
standard roles that you think about in an enterprise environment.
So what we've actually done is we've just created a default policy, but I want to go in and modify it a little bit further. Have a look in here. Now we have a whole bunch of options here. In this particular case, I'm going to change my scan time to be 5, and I want to change my CPU usage to be 50, and that's pretty much it.
Show the exclusions, yeah.
Yep. What you can also see is this option, allow users on endpoint computers to configure real-time settings. So that was, if you remember back in the original one, there was yellow bars on everything except for real-time. That's where you can adjust that for your users. So if you don't want to give them anything, you can basically just give them nothing. They can look at the user interface, but they can't do anything with that. If we have a look now, we've got all our exclusions are already pre-populated for the DNS, DHCP, and the DC roles, which is pretty good.
So that's 40 things you don't have to type in now.
Yep. So there's Spynet. So if you want DSS to work, you have to go in here and choose at least basic membership. Again, that's a decision you can make in your organisation. If you choose to opt out, then the DSS that we saw earlier isn't going to work because it's not going to be able to go out. We have a whole bunch of updates here. We've got UNC file share that was added in SP1. We have a new option here. Basically what this says is that if for some reason config manager or the box has been out of date for 2 cycles, force it to go to Windows Update and get an update. By using this precedent set here, we can actually set where it's going to go, but that's just another fallback mechanism to say, okay, if the default mechanism hasn't worked, just force it to get an update. Yep. There's our firewall settings. We can go in and manage the firewall, pick the firewall state per the typical domain network, private network, public network, the things you see most of the time. So I'm just going to OK on that, and then what we'll do is we'll assign this policy now. And again, you typically pick a collection for this, but I'm going to pick on Chicago in this case. And now when I go and force my friend Chicago to do an update, it's actually going to, and we'll see in a minute, that it will go and get that policy update.
Can you go back to the server for a minute?
Okay.
So while we're waiting for that, the thing I want to show you here is this precedence order.
Yep.
So you can see it's 3, 2, 1, highest,
Yep.
Medium, lowest. And so the idea is that if I've got 2 policies, in this case, the default server policy and the demo policy apply, demo is the one that's going to be applied because that one has the highest precedence.
Yep.
Okay. So they're not additive in that sense. They have that order.
Yep. So basically, you have a couple of catch-alls for your desktop. So if if a server pops up or a client pops up into your config manager that doesn't fit into any of the other policies, it will at least get a forefront endpoint policy, which is your default policy, and then you can tailor it from there. So we'll go back into our client. If we have a look at our settings are now changed to 50% and 5 AM, which is what I set in the policy. So that works quite well. The last thing I'm going to show is how this is reactive. So the scenario, we can set a role. Maybe you want to have a help desk operator that handles calls for malware or something like that. What you can do is you can actually Go back into the client machine. So again, this is a specific client, but this collection could be a whole bunch of machines. And you actually see you've got this FEP operations. So if we wanted to kick off a quick scan, and I'll just highlight the right machine instead of Chicago. If we want to kick off a scan, we just go run full scan on that machine. It's going to go out. Obviously, the purpose of the demo, we're going to go here, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to update the policy. But as Harris mentioned earlier, that's the 5 or 15 minutes. The other piece that we've got here is the configure FEP alerts. So we've got some granularity in what level of alerting we want to set up. So generate alert when the same malware is detected on a number of computers within the last 24 hours. So in that case, you've got an outbreak of malware in your organisation, so you can throw alerts for that. Generate alert when the same malware is repeatedly detected on one computer within an interval, and generate alert when that machine is just getting hammered with malware. So you can set a whole bunch of alerts on that. Now, if we go back here, we don't see that machine's scanning, which it should have been, but I'm sure it will. We'll just go back to the slide deck and we'll come back to that.
All right, so we're getting close to the end. I know you're all probably quite hungry, so we'll get there very shortly. So hopefully what you saw today is the deep integration between Config Manager 2012 and Forefront EndPoint 2012. There's integration in terms of the management experience, in terms of the reporting, and in terms of the infrastructure required to run it. So less servers, less moving parts, less things that can break, less things to set up. You saw some really neat demos on advanced detection that goes far beyond just signature-based detection, leveraging cloud services and on-prem infrastructure. You've seen how we've really improved the ability to delegate role-based access to the console so that your AV administrators and your config manager administrators.
It's scanning.
Oh, it is. Okay, good. Wonderful. Good. It does work, I promise. Again, it's beta. It'll get a little bit faster. And also, we're running on virtual machines that are located far away. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, we showed you how role-based access, you can really delegate the separation between your AV admins and your config manager admins, which is really important. We've tried to really simplify the way you configure and you deploy updates to make that process faster, easier, less error-prone. And we've put in those wonderful pre-built exclusions for those key workloads, so you can get yourself out of the process of having to put those in.
And I guess the key focus of the demos that we wanted to show you today was that it's simple. That I hope that came through in the demos, was that we're leveraging the benefits of Config Manager, of all those years and all those versions that the Config Manager guys have worked on, and we've just basically put FEP into there and we're using it to deploy it. So I hope that was, for me, the takeaway for the demos was that it's just simple to manage your AV and it's not a burden. You don't have to deploy any extra infrastructure.
That's right. That's right. So some links and resources I provided. These are the download locations for the beta. If you want to go out and get it, you can get the deck online if you want, or you can write this down. I recommend just downloading it. And then there's also a TechNet page on FEP 2012, so you can find out some more details. That will get updated as we go to RC and RTM. All right, with that, we're done. So thank you for attending. We'll talk about the evals just really quickly. Please do your evals.